In the spirit of reconciliation, we acknowledge the traditional custodians of country throughout Australia and their connection to land, sea, and community. We pay our respect to their elders, past and present, and extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Island people. Today, we acknowledge that sovereignty was never ceded. Just thank you all for coming. I really appreciate that all of you made the time to be here, and especially Terry McCosker, Dr. Terry McCosker. Quick housekeeping, please leave your webcams on if you can, because it's nicer for the speaker to have faces rather than blank screens. Just makes it more personal. Keep your microphones off, and if you have questions, post them in the chat, which is on the bottom of the screen, which you can only see when you wiggle your little mouse a little. It will appear on chat, and we will try to, Alan, Jethro, and May will try to answer. And if we can't, then just email us at info@vfca.org.au. And with that, we jump straight in, introduction to Dr. Terry McCosker. Hello, Terry. Terry probably doesn't need much introduction to anybody that's in the farming community. He's a farmer foremost, but also entrepreneur, innovator, inspirer, educator. He's taught thousands of farmers about grazing for profit, nutrition, farming systems. So with that, Terry, are you there? Can we hear you?
Yes, Gundy, have you got me?
Yes, we got you. Thank you.
Good.
Terry, we as vets, most of us listening will be probably veterinarians. You know, we know about carbon cycle biology, biochemistry, probably more than the average person. But every veterinarian, please maybe thank you, Terry, to take the time to enlighten us more. And we will give you our full attention. So that you can help us deepen our understanding of carbon, soil carbon. What does it have to do with climate change? We are an organization of veterinarians for climate action. So we want to help, and hopefully you can enlighten us and teach us something that we can then re-educate our clients, our farmers, you know, either as veterinarians in the farming community or as, you know, all small animal veterinarians as us using farming products to feed millions of cats and dogs or other animals, you know, like we are all involved in this journey. So with that, I hand it over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Gundy. And thank you, everybody, for giving up your evening. I see there's one face there I've seen before, at least, and Peter up in West Australia. Good to see you, mate.
Terry, good to see you again, mate.
Yeah, a very long time.
Yeah, over 30 years now.
Yes. Now, if I can, if you give me permission to share my screen, Gundy. I'll just find the right slideshow here. There it is. Okay, so I'd like to start with this, that agriculture basically uses up the resources because consumers will not pay the full price of food. And agriculture has been using up its resources now for probably the last 8,000 years. It's not something recent. And so the reason that I got into this in the first place was because of that. It's the environment that's actually paying the full price of food production. And so I thought we really need other ways to bring income back to farmers. And so I believe that carbon and environmental credits will provide a mechanism to return that additional income to farmers. And I'm going to show you some results at the end of this presentation, which are the first real results from soil carbon in Australia, and probably the first on any scale over time in the world. And I can tell you they're pretty exciting. And these are hot off the press. And so you're some of the first people to actually see them. I'd like to begin with ecology, because when we're farming and we're actually farming and working with ecosystems, and I got a very simple approach to the ecosystem, and I look at it as a pie. And at the centre of that pie, we've got carbon, we've got ecosystem services, water cycle, energy flow, which is how well we utilise sunlight energy, biodiversity and soil health, etc., that make up that pie. And for the last 8,000 years or so of agriculture, we've been shrinking the size of that ecological pie. Now, if we've done that through poor management or ignorance, it makes sense to me that we can increase the size of that pie by changing management on most landscapes. And while I've named all of those things separately, they cannot be separated. Every one of those things is completely interrelated, and you cannot change one without changing the other. So that's just a little bit of by way of background in terms of putting this carbon story in context. It really is part of a much bigger ecosystem. Carbon, as you would all know, is basically and measured in heat units, and it's basically a form of energy, whether we're burning it in a car or whether we're burning it in ourselves or burning it within an animal. It's still a form of energy. When we look at soil carbon, there's a whole pool of carbon there that is known as organic matter, organic material. But when I talk about carbon for the rest of the night, I'm going to be talking about organic carbon, which is about half of organic matter in round numbers. And that's the stable form of carbon in a soil. So it's basically it's humus, and it's it's already decomposed material, and that decomposed material would be decomposed living organisms, that were living, obviously, decomposed plant material, etc. And when we're looking at taking action on climate change, there's two things that we can do. We can avoid emissions, or we can sequester carbon. Now, avoided emission is lowering our fuel, lowering our power use, producing less methane from animals, etc. And to my mind, if climate change is a major problem, then it's like driving towards a cliff and putting that car in second gear, so we're driving to that cliff slower as we avoid emissions. If we really want to make a difference, we sequester carbon. That means we're pulling it out of the atmosphere and storing it generally in woody material, in trees and or into soils. The one I want to talk about tonight is actually soil carbon. And carbon generally is part of this carbon cycle, which is the process of birth, growth, reproduction, death and decay. And on the right-hand side of that cycle, photosynthesis drives carbon into every living thing. And that was invented about 375 million years ago, when the CO2 level in the atmosphere was 7,000 parts per million. But of course, that carbon also leaves every living thing. And as the carbon joins up with oxygen again, it goes back to CO2 and back to the atmosphere. So we have oxidation. And in really simple terms, sequestration is trying to balance photosynthesis and oxidation and make sure that photosynthesis exceeds oxidation, or at least the capture from photosynthesis exceeds oxidation. So sequestration is leaving some carbon behind every time we go round and through that cycle. But it's instructive to think about the size of that cycle and where the carbon actually is. So if we look at the carbon cycle itself on an annual basis, cycles around 150 gigatons. That's 150 billion tons of carbon, and that's carbon, not CO2, is cycling in and out of every living thing every year. There's around about 820 gigatons of carbon in the atmosphere. There's 620 gigatons of carbon in all the vegetation on Earth. And there's 1,580 gigatons of carbon in the top metre of soils. and that is after 8,000 years of farming. So if you add up the carbon in the atmosphere and the carbon in all vegetation, it doesn't match the carbon in the top metre of soils. Generally, our emissions from burning fossil fuels and making concrete is around about 9 to 10 gigatons of carbon a year. And you can add generally about another 2 gigatons to that from other emissions. So our total emissions are probably around the 12 gigatons of carbon a year. So to me, it's not a very big ask to take that 9 to 12 gigatons of carbon and put them away in a 1,580 gigaton storage. And that would be a massive boost to agriculture, to food production, the quality of food production. And the other thing that happens as we remove carbon from the atmosphere and put it into soils, we are also bringing water vapour with it. Now, one of the impacts on climate change, and in fact, water vapour has a much significantly greater heating impact within the atmosphere than CO2 does. So by putting carbon into soil, we're going to then be taking water vapour out of the atmosphere and storing it in soils, and carbon and storing it in soils. And when that carbon is from about 20 centimetres down, it's stable for about 1,000 to 2,000 years once it gets to about 20 centimetres. And the deeper we go with storing that carbon in the soil, the more stable it becomes. And soil carbon at around about 1.5 to 2 metres is stable for 10 to 12,000 years. So it's a pretty safe place to put it, and there's a lot of benefits from putting carbon into soils. These trees here give a little bit of an indication of what's happening within the carbon cycle. So Mother Nature is not just going to pour all that spare carbon into the atmosphere, and she hasn't been for the last 8,000 years. So you can see there's ambient CO2 levels at the moment. We see the size of that tree, plus 150 parts per million, plus 300 and plus 450 parts per million of CO2 in the atmosphere. And you'll see that plants are actually going to use a significant amount of that increased CO2 going into the atmosphere. So that 9 to 12 gigatons of carbon being released every year is not necessarily all going to the atmosphere. There's a big chunk of it that goes into the oceans, and there's a chunk of it that goes into vegetation. Now, how do we get carbon into soils? We're all pretty well aware of decomposition as a pathway, and the decomposition is coming from roots, not from the above ground part of the plant. You can go and put a lot of litter on top of a soil, and that litter will end up oxidizing rather than adding to soil organic carbon. So we've got to build good root systems. The second thing, though, is the main way in which we get carbon into the soil is what's called the liquid carbon pathway. And that's the process of photosynthesis. So photosynthesis, as you would all know, is taking CO2 out of the atmosphere, and then the plant separates out the carbon, hydrogen and oxygen and keeps the carbon behind and forms simple sugars. Now, the plant takes about 80% of the sugars that it produces each day in photosynthesis and throws that down into the roots. 50% of that energy goes into root development and growth. The other 50% of that energy, so around about 40% of all energy stored by the plant in sugars, is exuded into the root system. And the purpose of that is to feed the soil biology. And that's so the soil biology can then feed the plant. So contrary to popular belief, plants actually don't take nutrients from the soil. They're given those nutrients by the soil biology. That's with the possible exception of nitrogen. So if you've got too much nitrogen in the system and that nitrogen goes into solution, then the plant has no option but to take it up. But most of the elements that plants need are provided by soil biology. So there's a symbiotic relationship. The plant is sending that carbon out into the soil and saying to the biology in real time, I now need phosphorus, I need calcium, I need sulfur, zinc, or whatever it is that I need. That system is highly intelligent. The plant is actually able to communicate with that biology in real time to let it know what it wants. So what it does is it adds a whole lot of instructions to that sugar to communicate with the soil biology. So probably the primary biology in terms of sequestering carbon that's of interest to us is the mycorrhizal fungi. So the dark bit of the plant root there is the root, and the white bits are mycorrhizal fungi. They are the first ones that actually start to stabilise carbon within the soil. And they do that through the production of glomalin. So your glomalin in these slides here is dyed green colour, and the glomalin is built on the outer sheath of the fungal hyphae. And the glomalin itself is very high in carbon. It's 30 to 40% carbon. It's also stable for 7 to 42 years. And that glomalin has another function in soil, and that is to glue soil together and create soil particles and aggregate soils. I can't actually see if there's any questions coming up there. Is there any questions so far? I might just pull up there before I get into how is it measured.
No questions. We've just got Karen Enkler and Steve Sullings saying big supporters of your of our work, and Terry of your long-term and valuable work, but no questions at this point. Just a reminder, if anyone does have any questions, please feel free to post them in the chat function here.
Good, thanks, Alex. So I'll move on now to how do we actually measure it, because this is the tricky bit. And we don't do it the way we used to. We use a fair bit of science now in how to measure it. We use a gear like this. This is basically mining scale equipment so that we can punch holes down in any soil, and we can do it pretty quickly. We want to go down at least to about 1.2 metres. And when the soil comes out, it comes out in those plastic tubes that you can see on the right-hand side of that slide. Now, those tubes are in a cold room. So the reason for putting them immediately into a cold room is to stop the bugs, pull them up from chewing up the carbon that's in that soil. So they're kept cold until we get them into laboratory, until we're ready to actually measure them. Now, the technology that we use to measure soil carbon, this is an instrument that we built based on some plans from CSIRO. Down the bottom left-hand corner, you'll see an orange-looking thing. That's actually a gamma densitometer that shoots a gamma ray across the soil core, and the bit sticking out on the right-hand side works out how long it takes for those rays to get through that soil, and from that we can work out the density of the soil. Coming down from the top is a near-infrared spectrometer, and that measures moisture and carbon and a whole range of other soil properties that we can measure with that technology. As most of you would know, a spectrometer just gives you a whole lot of squiggly lines. And the real trick is to figure out what do those squiggly lines mean and how to interpret those back into water and soil organic carbon. So we've got some fairly sophisticated software that does a lot of that. And then we take calibration samples from some of those soil samples, and then we match the calibration sample to specific spots on the cores and specific spectra. And then from that, we build spectral models, and then the spectral model predicts the soil carbon. The beauty of this technology is that we can analyse carbon and bulk density all the way down through a soil. Traditionally, what you would do is you'd take the top 30 centimetres and you'd get one measure out of that, and then you'd go below 30 centimetres and you'd grind that up, take about a gram out of it, and that would be your measure below that. But this technology gives us a lot more accuracy in being able to figure out where the carbon is and measure it a lot easier. This is a carbon project in front of you. This is a 5,000 hectare property. All the different colours there are strata or CEAs. Now, the enemy of measuring soil carbon accurately is variability. You can drill two holes side by side, 10 centimetres apart, and you will get a different answer in each of those two holes. So extremely variable. So that's what we're fighting against. So if we just went out there and drove across that landscape and did transects across the landscape, we would have enormous variability in our results, and we wouldn't have any carbon to trade. So we break the landscape up based on soil type, slope, gamma readings, greenness indexes, vegetation types, management practices. We use about 8 or 9 covariates to analyse these soils and to work out where the boundaries should be on our strata. The numbers that you can see there are tonnes of organic carbon down to 1 metre. So the low levels there, the lowest part of the property was 40 to 41 tonnes of carbon per hectare, and the highest paddock on the place had 155 tonnes of carbon per hectare down to 1 metre. And that paddock happened to have leucaena in it. So legumes drive carbon sequestration. And that's due to the fact that soil biology wants to maintain a carbon-nitrogen ratio in soils of about 12 to 1. So you can have very low carbon and you'll have very low nitrogen. To be able to drive carbon up, you must be able to add nitrogen to let the carbon build. So as you build carbon, the nitrogen builds at the same rate and vice versa. And you maintain the 12 to 1 ratio. So that 40-tonne soil and the 155-tonne soil will both have a 12 to 1 carbon-nitrogen ratio. This is a slice out of that particular property. And the top slide there, coloured in with the red and the yellow on it, is 0 to 30 centimetres. This is measured after 2.5 years of drought, but 4 years into a soil carbon project, but was still measured within the drought. That dark red area is heavy black soil, cracking clay soils, which opened up through the drought. He had pasture dieback, which had removed the vegetation off the surface. And so it opened up and we lost a significant amount of carbon in the surface soil. But up on the left-hand side of that top slide, we've actually started to sequester carbon in the top 30 centimetres. Now that carbon is in, see where you can actually see the shape of that bit up there where it says up in here. That's that slice of country. So that country up in there is around the 40-odd tonnes of carbon per hectare, and it was forest country. What we found was that the forest country, which we would have expected not to sequester much carbon, actually sequestered quite a lot, and the better quality soils lost carbon in the top 30 centimetres. But the really exciting part of the story is that even though we'd lost carbon in the surface, we gained carbon and held it at depth. So below 30 centimetres, we've added a significant amount of carbon. And right across our carbon projects at the moment, we're running at around about 65 to 70% of the carbon sequestered is actually below 30 centimetres. Now, most science that you'll read and most papers that you will pick up have only ever measured carbon to 30 centimetres if they go down that far. So that's a pretty interesting part of the story. Now, what a farmer is adding to their landscape is organic carbon, and that's what we measure. And we measure the change in organic carbon. But what they get to sell is carbon dioxide. And the multiplier from organic carbon to carbon dioxide is 3.6 tonnes of carbon dioxide for each tonne of soil organic carbon. So even though the sequestration rate in soil organic carbon is quite low and slow, that multiplier is what actually makes it work. So this is the real question that a lot of farmers want to know, is it worth anything? Now, there are 4 drivers of return for a farmer. The first is the sequestration rate. So you could be sequestering at 1 tonne of carbon per hectare a year, 2 or 3. And that's the sort of range that we would expect to pick up in most of Australia, where it's possible to sequester carbon. And just to show you some numbers there, that this is a 2,000 hectare property with a 34 tonne carbon price, that's CO2 price. And if you just look across the total cash flow line there over 25 years, you'll see that half a tonne of carbon per hectare per year makes basically $1 million difference net to those projects. So the sequestration rate is a major driver of profitability. That sequestration rate is a function of management. And we might talk a little bit about that shortly. Obviously, the price of carbon is going to affect the return to a farmer. Up until not very long ago, the price of carbon was over $50 a tonne. It's currently back at about $27 a tonne, thanks to some really shonky work that's gone on at the top end within Australia. But the carbon price, if you actually start playing around with the numbers, what I've found is that the sequestration rate, profitability is much more sensitive to sequestration rate than it is to price. Cost of measurement is a two-edged sword, and I'll come back to that. And scale of projects. So small scale projects are very difficult to make viable at $27 a tonne. When we were up at $58 a tonne 6 weeks ago, small scale projects like down to 500 hectares were actually becoming viable, particularly with high sequestration rates. So if you had a 500 hectare project and you were able to do 2 tonnes of carbon per hectare per annum, that would be a viable and profitable project. So one of the things that a lot of farmers are facing now is that there's a lot of people out there saying they're going to be able to measure carbon for them. And I think there's nearly a new one starts up every week at the moment. And this is 2 quotes on a 1,600 hectare property. So the first aggregator has quoted $2,250 to do the job. This is to baseline the property. They're going to take 9 samples and they're going to take 5% of the credits at the end of the day. B has quoted $20,000 to do the same job. They're going to take 50 samples. They're going to take 18% of the carbon credits at the end of the day. Now, when I run these numbers past farmers without showing them the bottom of this slide, 90% of them go for the cheap one. If you went for the cheap one, you would have 0 accus to sell. The guy that paid $20,000 and gave away 18% of his credits had a net income of $110,000 after 5 years. The guy that paid $2,250 was actually $4,500 out of pocket after 5 years. So the cost is important for this reason, is that the number of samples are actually quite critical. And as you would all know a bit about stats and variability. So in carbon trading, you get heavily discounted for high variance in your data. So for example, if I had, say 60 tonnes of carbon per hectare out there, and I'm looking after 5 years for 5 tonne change in that 60 tonnes, if my measurement system was measuring that 5 tonnes plus or minus 10 tonnes, then I've got no hope of trading that 5 tonnes of carbon that I'd actually sequestered. So we need to take more samples, which means the cost goes up. But once we get the accuracy there, then we don't get heavily discounted and we get more ACCUs to sell. So an ACCU is a carbon credit unit, which is 1 tonne of CO2, Australian carbon credit unit. So that's why we need to be fairly careful about how we do these sort of projects. The philosophy that we take to this is that the real focus should be on business as usual. If a farmer's going to do this, grazier farmer, whoever it is, they need to be making change to management on their properties for the right reasons. And that is that they want to get a productivity increase and they want to see an improvement in their ecosystem. Carbon credits can be a secondary source of income if you do that. I think if people look at this as being, well, I'm just going to do various practices to get carbon credits, I don't think that they're going to have long-term outcomes because they'll be doing stuff for the wrong reasons. So soil carbon is an outcome from good management, and that is probably the most important message I'd like you to take away tonight. I don't know whether you're interested in how to do a soil carbon project or not. I can come back to that if you are later on. This is what a soil carbon project looks like. Those red patches in there are exclusion areas. So they could be creeks, they could be heavy timbered areas, they could be rocks, hills, the stuff that we just can't get into or sample, or it's not worth it. So they're excluded. The average that we've found at the moment is across our projects, about 30% of properties generally across the board have been ended up excluded. The money is, the calculations of carbon sequestration and abatement are made on what's called a CEA, or a carbon estimation area. Now that you could have one of those on a property, or you could have several on a property, or you could have several properties owned by the one person, and they could have different CEAs on each of those properties. So the carbon is basically calculated and paid for on the basis of a CEA. So that's a really critical bit of the whole method. Projects have to be registered with the regulator to be able to create ACCUs, and they have to be registered before you do anything. So you cannot make your practice change beforehand. We can't start the baselining beforehand. And so it's a fairly lengthy process. From the time people approach us to want to do a carbon project to the time that we could start it or get to the registration or through registration can be anywhere from 6 or 8 or 10 months. Now, I think this is probably one of the most important slides I've got here tonight, and I won't go too much further than this. And there's a real question that needs to be asked, is do farmers want to or need to be net zero or carbon neutral? And they are two entirely different things. So if we look at on the left-hand side there, the blue bit, that is, we've got a baseline level in soil organic carbon. We've found an increase in soil organic carbon. But when we do a baseline, we also baseline emissions. So the red bit there is the baseline emissions. And in this particular instance, we've gone over our baseline emissions. So then if you move across to the right-hand graph, those emissions above baseline must be removed from your sequestration before you can calculate your net abatement. Now, when you do that, if a farmer does that, and then they've got carbon credits to sell, they are at net zero. In other words, their emissions are not greater than their baseline emissions. That is essentially what net zero means. Carbon neutral would mean that you would have to take a slice of those green credits left and retire them to account for the red baseline emissions. And you would have to do that annually. Now, what I would be advising my clients at the moment is to become net zero and then see who's going to pay you and what they're going to pay you for product to get you to go carbon neutral, because it's going to cost you in real hard cash a lot of money to go carbon neutral. So there's just getting your head around those two terms, net zero and carbon neutral, are quite important, because there's a lot of discussion now in the bush, and most you probably will have come across it, where people, farmers and graziers and sowing, are starting to wonder, you know, what have I got to do to become carbon neutral? And for me, the first step is to become net zero, and after that you can make decisions about whether you want to be carbon neutral or not, and that'll be an economic decision basically. Show you a couple of case studies and then we'll pull up. So this is a cell grazed property on the right and a continuously grazed property on the left at Uralla, New South Wales. You can see the difference in the grass growth, and you can see the difference in the colour of that soil. The guy on the right has been sequestering 3 tonnes of carbon per hectare per annum. We measured that over a 7-year period. So compared to the guy on the left. So 3 tonnes of carbon per hectare per annum is a lot of carbon, and that would be an extremely profitable project at that sort of level of sequestration. I won't bother about that one. I'll just show you some real data now to finish up on. These are 5 properties that have been long-term clients of mine. They start in central Queensland. They go down through the Burnett, down into the Southern Downs, and then down into the northern tablelands of New South Wales. You can see the CEA areas there is 14,000 hectares total. The grazed area is nearly 19,000 hectares. The annual average rainfall there across them is 697 mils. Their 5-year average rainfall over this period where we measured the carbon change was 570, so they're 82% across the board. But their rolling rainfall total got down to 40% of their average annual rainfall. And they stayed there for at least 2 years out of the 5 years. The top guy there had 2 floods. The last one had been burnt out totally in 2019 with the bushfires in New South Wales. The top 3 all had pasture dieback for this whole period, and up to 30% of their property was affected by pasture dieback. But they were all very good grazing managers. And these are the outcomes. So I've calculated the annual EBIT from carbon. So this is net profit from carbon after paying, before tax and interest, after paying for 2 measurements and their commission. So you'll see that the average income across those 5 properties, and including the one that went backwards, is $117 per hectare per annum. These are all cattle producers. So I've got the data from the top 4. Their annualised EBIT over the same 5-year period from running cattle was an average of $23 per hectare per annum. And then I thought, well, I'll look at the last year, which is the highest cattle prices on record. And the last guy was still in drought, the guy with at -19 was still in drought at the time. The others obviously picked up significantly compared to their 5-year annual EBITs. And then you can compare that to the average EBIT across our benchmarking group. So the average producer in the best year on record for cattle prices had a $46 per hectare annual EBIT from livestock production. So you can see from that in those environments, the carbon income, and that carbon income's at $35 a tonne CO2, you can see that carbon income is significantly greater than the income from livestock. Now, as we move further south in southern Australia, we get down to southern New South Wales, Victoria, you're probably going to be looking at EBITs at the moment with sheep and cattle prices where they are of around the $400 a hectare. So significantly higher than central Queensland. But I would also expect their sequestration rates to be higher. So they're probably, the carbon income's probably going to get back closer to their livestock income, but it potentially will double it at $35 a tonne. And once we get up around the $80 to $100 a tonne, then the carbon income will exceed livestock income significantly. So it is not stuff to be taken lightly. And I think those properties there had every real world problem that you could actually throw at them over the last 5 years. So, whoops. Yeah. I'll better pull up there and allow some time for questions. And I'll stop sharing so we can see each other again.
Thank you, Terry. That's amazingly encouraging for everybody in the farming community to have another stream of income, you know, once this is all rolling. We have got a few questions. Does anybody want to post a question? Just unmute yourself.
We've got a few questions in the chat. I'm happy to read them out as we go through them.
Yeah.
Maybe start with those, Alex. Start from the top.
Yeah.
Work through them.
Let me just check. I'm getting the first one first. Yes. David Adams, glomalin, new to me. I just Googled that and found it was discovered in 1996, which is very interesting. Something I learned this evening.
That's correct.
Mike Nunn was first with the question. When using your scans, a CANS unit, how many holes do you drill per hectare on average?
It's hectares per hole, and that will depend entirely on the landscape variability. We've got very sophisticated algorithms that actually look at that variability and work out how many CEAs we need and then how many strata we need. And then it's a question of how many samples we take in the strata. There's a minimum number of 9 that we have to take per CEA, but we take significantly more than that. So it's, I suppose on average, we're probably averaging about 1 core per 13 hectares.
Thanks, Terry. Just a time check as well. We've got about 12 minutes and we also wanted to talk through our election toolkit before the end at 8 p.m. So hopefully we can get through all of that. The next question is from Rick White. Is soil carbon sequestration continuously linear with improved management?
The answer to that is yes.
Oh, there's a there's a whole bit after that as well. If not, is it fair to reward a producer with a poor management history for improvement from a low baseline, compared with a producer who has maintained or improved soil carbon and therefore has less room to improve from his baseline?
Yeah. That's not fair, but that's the legislation we're dealing with. So actually I jumped in a bit quickly there. It's not totally linear. So soil carbon sequestration is quite slow in tonnes per hectare per annum until you get to about 2% organic carbon, and then it accelerates. So the rate of sequestration could go up about threefold on what it was. So you sort of bounce along the bottom a little bit. So having a degraded property means that you spend much, much longer at the lower sequestration rate. So there is a sort of a penalty there. But yeah, at the end of the day, it's not terribly fair.
Thanks, Terry.
Yeah, thanks, Terry. Next question from Mark Ship. What is the contribution of livestock to soil carbon? That's a big question.
They're absolutely critical. And even in terms of the regulations, you can't do a carbon project if you take all the livestock out. So we've got one carbon project going through to be registered at the moment that runs horses. All the rest are either cattle or sheep, and at this stage, most of them are cattle. But the cattle are the animal, the ruminant or the grazing animal is absolutely essential, because that stimulation of the grazing increases the photosynthetic capacity and use of the plant. So we use more sunlight and we drive more carbon into the soil because of the grazing.
Thanks, Terry. Next question, David Adams. Is this approach to carbon uniquely Australia? What methods are used elsewhere?
Australia leads the world. We're the only ones in the world with that technology. We have the highest standard methodology in the world, the highest integrity methodology in the world. So we are leaders, but there are other countries that will allow you to do soil carbon projects, but nothing like the rigour that we have in Australia.
Next question from Lucy Collins. I've heard that if a farm is damaged by fire, they can lose their ACCUs/carbon credits. I may not have this terminology right.
No, that's correct. If it was a vegetation project and you were earning carbon credits off trees and those trees burnt down, basically you've got to make good. You have time to regrow them. If they weren't going to regrow them themselves, you'd have to replant them. In terms of soil carbon, we've just had one of those properties, and I think that a combination of the fire and the drought reduced the sequestration rate on that property by about 2/3 on what we thought was the potential. So it certainly reduced it, but didn't stop it. And you will lose the carbon, probably depends on the heat of the fire. So a cool fire, you won't lose anything. A hot fire, you're probably going to lose carbon down to 10 centimetres, but you won't lose the carbon that's at depth. And that carbon will rebuild again when the plants get growing.
Fascinating. Thank you. I'll take a couple more questions, then I'll move to the next part of the seminar, just aware of the time. So we've got some comments here. Janet Barry has a question. Carbon credits appear to be related to an increasing soil carbon level. Surely, even a good farmer with improving management cannot expect to see an ever increasing soil carbon level year after year.
That is probably going to take me longer than you need, than you've got for me at the moment to answer that question. It's not a simple question to answer. There's quite a complex answer to it, but the very, very short answer is that they can actually sequester carbon into infinity. And firstly, what happens is it goes down to depth, and then secondly, all you do is grow soil. That's the short answer.
Okay, thank you. We'll appreciate that short answer. I'm aware that there are other questions. And if people have questions after this, or sometimes something might pop into your head a few days later, or you're walking the dog, doing your thinking time, please do get in touch with us. info@vfca.org.au. if you have following questions, because it's such a fascinating topic and we'd love to be able to give as much information as we can. Also aware that time is running short of the webinar, and it would be great to move on to the next piece, which my colleague Jethro will take us through.
Thank you, Al, and thank you, Terry. Yes, team, I am going to quickly run us through something. I'll be nice and brief. But before I do that, and people start running away, it's always lovely to get a group photo. So if you don't mind, if you've turned your camera off, but you're happy to have it on, please put it on. I'm going to take a screenshot in 5 seconds. So everyone, make sure your hair's done and your makeup's on. Here we go. Screenshot in 3, 2, 1. Perfect. Thank you. All right. Just to prove that we're actually doing things. This is always nice to have photo evidence. All right, team. Like I promised, we are going to show you one other way that you can take all this useful information and then put it into something useful. Not all of us have farms that we can do these projects on, but there are other ways that we can do it. You may have heard that there's a small little election coming up in Australia. And one great thing we can do with all this information is to tell your candidates about it. The more we can tell them all this information that we're getting, the more knowledge that they get, the less all the confusing and misinformation that will get to them. So we want to communicate to them as much as we can, all this amazing information. So the wonderful team, wonderful volunteers, Evie and the communications team at VFCA put together a communications toolkit, and we've put it on the website as an election toolkit for this coming election. I've got a bit of a secret to share with you. I'm not particularly politically literate. So before this, I had never actually written to an MP or a candidate. It terrified me. I thought I wasn't knowledgeable enough, or it was too complicated. So when I found out that it was this simple, even I was able to go and do it. So hopefully you can too. Here's what we did. I'm just going to quickly share my screen. All you have to do is jump online, head over to vfca.org.au. It'll pull up this wonderful homepage with a funny looking echidna on the front, and our election toolkit is right here, easy for you to find. In here, you have a list of a bunch of things that we can do, but the one we wanted to talk about today is writing to your candidate. There are 3 steps. First, you've got to figure out actually who you're writing to. And for me, I'm actually moving to Margaret River next year. So I did this process because I didn't actually know what electorate or what my candidates were going to be. So all you do is you find this link. Margaret River. So you find out we're in a forest, WA, and easy as that, I've now found a list of all my candidates for that electorate. So that was, if we go back to the election toolkit, it's just this little link here will bring you to that site. So if you don't even know your candidates, they are that easy to find. Once you find your candidate, so let's just use Nola Marino as an example. You do have to then find their contact details. Luckily enough, if you just type in their name into any search, oh, sorry about the typo, will it still find it? It does too, here we go. Find that candidate's website, and surely enough, there'll be a contact. Once you're on their contact page, you're there. You're now ready to send your candidate a message. Name, Jethro. Last, Hudge. Suburb. I don't need that, it's fine. I can hear you all judging the speed of my typing. All right, and my message here is our tricky little, well, not tricky, this is, you've got 2 options. One, you can write your own message. You've now got all this wonderful information. However, to make it even easier for everyone out there, step number 3, because we already found out how to contact them. Step number 3, what do I say? Another amazing group of VFCA have written a template email for everyone. Click the button, it downloads, open it on up, and then just copy and paste this text here. Simple as that. You now have a wonderful letter ready to go to send to your candidate. All you have to change is a few things like the candidate's address. It's not needed because we're doing email, candidate's name, Nola Reno, name of the electorate is Forest. Head on down to the bottom to put your own name into it. I have not got that far to become a doctor yet, unlike all you far more intelligent people. And then that's it. We now have, oh, hang on, there's a bit of formatting in here that went a bit strange. Let's just get rid of that. But that's it. We now have a well-written, amazing letter to send to a candidate over in WA. Prove that you're not a robot. Hit submit. And that only took 5 minutes to send a message to a candidate. If I can do it in 5 minutes, I'm sure there is a bunch of people out there who can do it as well. There are a lot of different candidates out there, obviously, and different parties. We want everyone to know all the information. We're not telling you to go and bug one party in particular. Every party, every candidate, we need them to have all the information to make all the correct decisions for us. So please go out there and tell them all the wonderful information that you've now learned from Terry or from other VFCA or reputable sources. Anyway, I will leave it there. Thanks for listening to me rambling. I will move over back to Gundi if you want to play us out.
Yes, thank you, Jethro. Thank you, Terry. Thank you so much. I think there will be lots of interest, and especially your first slides, about where the carbon is and how, where does it have to go? I think we as veterinarians are, the rural ones of us, are much in the center of this whole discussion. So thanks for clarifying that about, where the money is for farmers. That's a great incentive, and just all the knowledge, all you do. Thank you, super much from the environment and every one of us. So thanks for making the time.
Thank you, Gandhi. Thank you all for attending and listening. And a lot of great questions there too.
Yes, I hope we'll hear from you again and can do another webinar in the future. So just to teach us all about carbon and soil and livestock in landscapes. Thank you.
Happy to.
Bye, everybody.